Good afternoon, everybody. And my name's Debbie Abrahams. I'm the MP for Oldham East and Saddleworth, but I'm also the co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group for compassionate politics. So what is compassionate politics? Compassionate politics is about working to create a new political culture, one which is more inclusive, is more compassionate, but is also more cooperative. So when we can't agree on everything, we also need to work out how we work in a more collaborative way. Now, there are many ways we can work to do that from inside Parliament, and believe me, we are. We recognise that the culture of politics extends far beyond the parliamentary estate and our constituency offices. It also involves the media. In fact, for those of you who might have read Professor Sir Michael Marmot's COVID review at the end of last year, you may have noticed one of the factors that he identified as driving the high and unequal COVID death toll across the country was the divisive culture in politics at the moment. So the importance of this cannot be underestimated. The media play a vital role in communicating the work of politicians, holding us to account and acting as a space for debate and dialogue. But there is also a risk that in the search for a headline, stories may be sensationalized or oversimplified, and key issues may be overlooked because a dominant narrative has become entrenched. And we can all think of examples of where that is happening. That is why we're very keen to work with journalists, such as the wonderful panel that we have here today, to ensure that reporting and political reporting in particular does, where possible, foster an atmosphere of open, honest, and rigorous debate. Public perception seems to suggest that the culture in the British media, or at least in certain sections of the media, might have strayed too far from this ambition. Polling by Compassion Politics with Opinion found that 49% believe there is a problem of racism in the media. 65% believe the media is having a damaging impact on society, and 4 in 5 think the media has a tendency to over-sensationalize stories. So with me to discuss these findings, the good, bad and the ugly of British media, the British media environment and options for reform are Amber de Botton, Head of Politics at ITV News and former Deputy Head of Politics for Sky News. Haroon, Siddique, Legal Affairs Correspondent for The Guardian. Katy, Searle, Executive Editor for Politics in the BBC. Rachel, Sylvester for The Times and a presenter on Times Radio. And Arjun, Alim. So welcome all of you. And if I could just say a massive thank you to Baroness Jenny Jones, who is going to take over the chair for now. I actually have to go and deliver my speech on the Queen's speech around health and social care in a moment. So my apologies for having to miss this, and I look forward to viewing the webinar later. Do keep your questions coming in through the chat, and they will all be picked up after the presentations from our panel. Thank you so much, everyone.
Debbie, thank you, and feel free to come back, at any moment, and take back over. I have 2 declarations to make. The first is that I could have a power outage because we have an electrician in the house at the moment. And the second is I have a journalist daughter. And so I feel I'm on both, well, I was going to say sides in this debate, but of course there are no sides. We're all looking for a better objective. So all of our speakers have 4 minutes, which I think is an incredibly short time for them all to express what they want to say, but I will, I'm afraid I will try to stop them so that there's plenty of time for questions, and I hope they don't take that the wrong way. So first, we're going to hear from Amber de Botton. Please go.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, I mean, actually 4 minutes feels like quite a long time in TV, that's for sure. I mean, if I just start sort of explaining a little bit about what I do, I am, I've been in the lobby for 12 years. So I've got a sort of breadth of experience from my time in political journalism. And I'm actually leaving the lobby this month to take up a new role with ITV News as head of UK News. So I feel like I've done my time, but also that I've got sort of some interesting things to say, but also how politics has changed in the time that I have been there. I mean, what's interesting for me is working in TV news, and especially for ITV News, we have a sort of quite a unique USP in how we try and treat political journalism. And that is basically that political journalism isn't just lobby journalism. It's actually about, you know, if you say ITV News to people, we like to do the human stories first and foremost in everything that we do. So that's about looking at communities and people's stories. So for some recent examples of that, we've done sort of Dan Hewitt's work in Croydon with housing, or Paul Brand's work on care homes. And that the reason I want to make that distinction is I think there's a real difference between what I've called lobby journalism and political journalism more broadly, because lobby journalism, I think by its nature, and politics by its nature, is somewhat adversarial. It's built into the system. And therefore the he said, she said is sort of, is to a certain extent, sometimes inescapable. But you also do have stories and ways of doing politics whereby you can bring different organizations and different parties together because you're highlighting an issue that clearly needs to change. And actually people understand that and will work together to create that change and create policy changes, because it isn't necessarily about beating somebody, it's about improving the greater good. And I think that we've had some real success with that. And that's an area that I'm keen to keep pursuing and what we do. But you know, there clearly are problems in the way that we address each other in political journalism, but also how we work with politicians. I mean, I sat down the other day with 3 pretty well-known female senior political journalists, all of whom have been doing it for a while. And I sort of mentioned I was doing this, and I sort of said, you know, what's your experience of it? And they all had experience, like very negative experiences. One of whom had been doxxed, which means that someone had posted their home address online. One of whom had had police involvement. And the common factor between it all, I said, why do we think this is on the increase? And they agreed it was on the increase in the last sort of few years, seemed to be because of the blurring of the line between public and private. And that is, you know, political journalists are expected to have a public profile. And sometimes a lot of that is arriving through social media. And I think creating a line and putting a line between the public and the private is really important, both for politicians, but also for political journalists as well. And I think, you know, ultimately there is a role for that to and fro to continue, because it is politics and it's adversarial, and it's important that we, you know, hear from the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition, and that to its nature is going to have some friction between it. But if I look very quickly about what we could do practically, I think demystifying TV political journalism for MPs and the public more broadly is important. You know, I will always try and get a woman on to appear if we feel we haven't got that diversity, or, you know, certain communities or certain voices. You know, you're always looking for that diversity of thought and diversity of story in order to make sure that you're not just creating that Westminster bubble and perpetuating it. And then I suppose it's sort of that line between what is private for people involved in politics and what is public, and just making sure that we respect and continue to work out what that is, because I think as social media continues to gain prominence, we just need to keep checking that and making sure that we are being compassionate in the way that we all talk to each other.
Amber, that's fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to move on to Haroon, if Haroon is okay with that. And so 4 minutes, Haroon, please.
Okay, thanks. So I've never worked on, well, not really, I haven't worked in the lobby. I've done a bit of political journalism online, but so my take is going to be slightly different. I mean, what I'd say is that the media likes to think it's got a lot better in terms of racism, sexism, those kind of issues, and it probably has. I think you only had to look, the Guardian, my paper recently did a thing of kind of all the wrong steps it had taken in history, which included kind of supporting the Confederates during the American Civil War. But there were more recent things than that as well. But I think you only have to look at kind of this is a story that people are probably fed up with, but the Meghan Markle story and the reaction to that, and there were issues of not only racism but sexism, you know, this narrative that she's bossy, which I'm not sure I've ever seen a man described as bossy in the press. And also there was you know, mental health issues and people saying, oh, she's lying about being suicidal. At the same time, when we say we've moved on from that headline years ago in the tabloids, which said about Frank Bruno, he's nuts, or whatever it was when he was sectioned. So we have moved on to some extent, but when there's the chance to get headlines, I think there is reversion to some aspects that are just not very nice. I mean, I think the reason I was asked to come on here was because after the Meghan Markle stuff, the Society of Editors came out and said, you know, there's no racism or bigotry in the British press, and that's just untrue. And that's why I arranged a letter signed by people of journalists of colour from all different organisations within the media, and we said, well, this isn't true, this is defensive, it's simplistic. And I think we as journalists, I don't view myself as a campaigning journalist. I'm not one of those journalists who's on social media all the time, but this was kind of a line in the sand for me when an organisation that purports to represent all of us is saying flat out there's no bigotry or journalism. I just felt something had to be done, and so I helped instigate that letter. And I think I am a believer in journalistic objectivity, but there are certain things that you have to defend, and that's, you know, you have to talk out about racism, sexism, homophobia. I think those are no-brainers that you do that, and that should not be interpreted as a kind of you not being objective. So there are problems, but I think we have the ability to speak out, and we should do. But I think it's also, you know, a lot of the decisions about headlines, about content are not made at my pay grade, they're made higher. So it's important that the people there are also aware of these issues and thinking about them. And I really think diversity is important there, because I think, like it or not, when you come from a community that or gender that feels marginalized, you are more aware of those issues, and that's why people sometimes think, oh, diversity, why do people bang on about it? But that's the importance of it, and we are seeing some change at lower levels, but I think and schemes to get people in at lower levels, but I think it's really important to have that higher up as well.
Haroon, thank you very much. I bang on about misogyny all the time in the House of Lords, so I quite understand and absolutely agree. And we'll go on to Katy Searle next, please.
Hi everyone, thanks very much, Jenny. So I wanted to pick up on this thought of social media and how I think it's changed the culture completely. And I think we should be really clear of the impact it's had and look at the solutions to how we relate to each other, because I think it is the source of a great deal of conflict. And there's a couple of areas I think it's worth just noting, that Amber's already mentioned some of them. I think there's the effect on our journalism, which I think has been enormous. So, you know, I've worked at the BBC for a very long time, in the lobby for 7 years. When I came to Westminster, we were still using press association and other forms of agency to see where the stories were coming from and follow the news. They're still around and they're still influential, but I've got to say I haven't looked at PA for years, actually. I always look at Twitter. And Twitter is exceptional in Westminster in a way that, of course, it is not in the outside world at all, but it forms a huge influence in the lobby particularly, and Parliament as a whole. And I think it's the speed, the effect on the speed of our stories is significant. So where we may have had 2 or 3 news cycles in a day, maybe start somewhere in the morning, another one in our early afternoon, a third in the evening going into the next morning, we're now looking at stories being updated hour on hour, sometimes minute by minute. Remind you of the famous, or the infamous, I should say, punch that never was in the 2019 election, which was there and gone within an hour, but it was a huge, made huge impact at the time, and it caused a great deal of pointing fingers and anger at the time as well. So the effect on the speed of our stories should not be underestimated by the use of social media. Everyone is a journalist now, so everyone can publish what they feel they have the right to say, which takes me on to the pressure that it also feeds in. I think both on journalism, there's a huge pressure for journalists to beat each other on Twitter, which puts pressure on them saying perhaps things that they shouldn't say or wouldn't say in another forum. And I always say to my teams, as we do across the BBC, and I'm sure in lots of media organisations, don't say anything that you wouldn't say on air. And that's a really, really important thing to remember, but it's a very, very easy one to forget, I find. You know, and lots of our journalists who are not necessarily on air are caught either retweeting something or liking something that they really shouldn't do. And you know, it's one of the things our new Director General has taken very seriously in terms of our impartiality, and I wholly agree with it, because it's an easy thing, which people then don't really realise the impact they have on our wider reputation. And I'd often be phoned by various parties saying, you know, John Smith in children's unit or whatever it might be has tweeted this or said that, and they have no idea that it has a social comment on it, has a political comment. So it's really, really important in reputational terms as well. And then I just want to mention the obvious, which is the abuse and, you know, the way that people use social media to abuse and insult people, which again has been hugely well documented, of course. But it really takes you to security problems that Amber mentioned before, and it takes you to a wholly unsavoury way of public debate, and I think it's very worrying. I think if you look at the platforms, the social media platforms are just not willing to really sort of take this up, and of course it's incredibly complicated around free speech, etc. But it's something that I think, you know, in the longer term we need to address. Just one other thing, Jenny, if I may, is in our digital age, the way the political parties are using digital platforms to get their message across, which I think is worth noting. Which I've got to say, I don't blame them. It is a use to get videos straight to their audience, to their voters. But from a journalistic perspective, of course, it gets around the key point of accountability, and the more they do that, the more we are unable to hold them to account and ask those really important questions. So that's something that's very much at the forefront of my mind as well.
Katy, thank you very much. We'll go on now to Justin.
I'm actually stepping in for Justin. I think I'm at the end.
Oh, I'm so sorry. So sorry. That's my... oh, you're at the end. Do you want to be at the end? Because I'm happy to hear from you now. I was trying to make it girl, boy, if that's not too old-fashioned. Arjun, would you like to? Yeah.
Sure, that's completely fine. Thank you very much for having me on this panel. I think I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle because I am probably the youngest person here. I've been in media for 2 or 3 years now. I'm 24 years old. I've been working at the Evening Standard and the Independent, and I've sort of had a look at all the different areas of our coverage, from politics to culture, and I've done a lot of campaigning. I think, unlike Haroon, I think I would describe myself as a campaigning journalist because of our work on food poverty, specifically last year during lockdown. I think for a lot of what I was going to say has already been said, honestly, by much more experienced colleagues, but I think I'll make 2 points. The first one is when I look around newsrooms, I still don't see enough people that look like me. I don't just mean ethnic minorities, I also mean my age. And there's a big problem because newsrooms aren't hiring as much, which means the average age of a newsroom is going up, which means that people my age, people born after 1990, see less content written by people like them, tailored to their interests and their needs and their lives. A good example of this is the lack of youth participation in elections. I was in travel quarantine for the local elections in London. I couldn't find a single friend who was registered to vote for me. And the number one candidate in London amongst 18 to 30-year-olds is someone you may not have heard of, who's a YouTuber called Nico Omalana. I think that is really, really interesting. And actually, a lot of my friends say to me, Arjun, the only time I ever pick up a newspaper now is when you're in it, which is both a compliment and also very, very sad. So we need to see more young people definitely in newsrooms with their agendas and their content. And the second thing I will say, which leads from that and leads to the fact that youth are very turned off traditional news, is what seems to us to be the hyper partisanship of a lot of news coverage, a lot of political news coverage, and the confrontational nature of it. So I helped to run the Evening Standard's Food for London Now campaign last year, which raised £10 million to help the work of the Felix Project to redistribute food around London. We distributed food for about 21 million meals last year, which really helped people who were in a bad spot because of lockdown. But the issue is that too much traditional coverage of food poverty came from this hyper-partisan angle where basically the newspapers are divided into those that support the big left-wing party and the others that support the big right-wing party. And the problem with that is that they failed to see the systemic problems that cause food poverty, because one side is saying, oh, it's austerity for the last 10 years, and the other side is saying, oh, it's personal responsibility. And so what that means is that a lot of young people, many of whom find themselves in these situations of deprivation, do not see themselves in that. So I think really our hyper-partisan news media mirrors a political culture that is ultimately quite toxic and confrontational. And I think if you look at countries like Germany, where we have more of a fairer electoral system, which has more diversity of voices, you see that a lot less. That's kind of all I have to say on that.
Arjun, thank you very much indeed. I take your point about being the youngest person in the room. I'm often the oldest. Well, actually not in the House of Lords, obviously, but and Rachel, our final speaker, Rachel Sylvester.
Hi, Jenny, thank you. I suppose the first point I wanted to make, I think Arjun's absolutely right that this toxic culture is off-putting to voters and to readers a lot of the time, but we are kind of caught in that trap because conflict is newsworthy and everyone getting on nicely isn't as newsworthy often. So I did a story at the weekend about a row between Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak over education spending. If that negotiation had all gone through and it was all absolutely fine and everybody was getting on, that wouldn't be a story. So there is something built into news that is often inherently around conflict. But I think what's happened recently, certainly since I started writing about politics, back in '96 actually, is that conflict and polarization has become much, much more built into the political system. And it's not just the party structures, you know, Labour versus Tory, Prime Minister versus Leader of the Opposition, as it used to be at Prime Minister's Question Time. It's much more cultural, ideological, almost moral. So people don't any longer have a difference of opinion about a policy. It's they're right, they're wrong, you're wrong, you know, I'm moral, you're almost evil for disagreeing. And I think that has then seeped sometimes into the media coverage as well. The other thing I think is interesting, I'm interested what the broadcasters feel about this, is I think sometimes for the sake of kind of balance, conflict is built into discussion. So you have to, I found it myself, if I'm on a panel, I have to represent a particular point of view. And that makes it very difficult to say, or you're there to represent a particular point of view up against someone else on the other side. And actually quite often the truth is on the one hand and on the other hand. So it's quite difficult to have a nuanced discussion in that context. That obviously that the whole Brexit referendum put that onto speed or steroids, whatever the analogy is, it made it very divided, polarized, one side, the other side. And that has, though, I think, continued. And I think also, I think there's a difference between interviews, between broadcast interviews and newspaper interviews. So broadcast interviews have to be much more confrontational because it's almost like a stage managed showdown between the journalist and politician. With newspaper interviews, you can be a little bit more less confrontational. You're trying to find out the information, and you're trying to sort of get good quotes out of them, but you're not necessarily trying to have a on-air punch-up or sort of staged conflict. So I think there's differences between different bits of the media there, and also I suppose between the tabloids and the broadsheets in newspaper terms. So the media, I think you can't lump it all completely together. On the other side, though, I do think that the media, as Katy was saying, has a really important role to play in rising above the increasingly kind of polarized world of social media. And that if we can do anything, it's standing up against fake news, really setting out what the truth is, making sure that we say there is a truth, that it isn't all relative, it isn't just about opinion, that there are facts, and that facts matter. And I really do think that that's something important that the media can do, and that's a kind of noble cause, if you like. And that isn't about conflict, that is something positive that we can do. And also, really importantly, a lot of the nastiness on social media is associated with anonymity. And we have our names to our pieces or our faces on air. And that's quite an important thing. There's an accountability to that, which really matters. Yeah, I think we can, if we get it right, we can sort of be, certainly as a columnist, it's possible to be a slightly still small voice of calm, that it doesn't have to be all ranty and ravey and, you know, conflict and bust-ups the whole time. And actually, I think there's a public appetite for a little bit more, not happy news. I thought Martin Lewis got it wrong. People don't just want everything to be fluffy and happy-clappy, but they do want reason. They do want calm debate. They don't want everything to be conflictual and confrontational. And I think actually viewers and readers and voters are slightly put off by this polarization and the endless punch-ups. So in a way, I think the two sides feed off each other. So the political system and the media system have got into this vicious circle of conflict and polarized debate. But I don't think it necessarily has to be like that. And actually, I think there's an appetite for something different, but maybe I'm over idealizing it.
Thank you very much indeed. There's been some questions coming in, and I will hold off asking my questions. I'll take you all responding in the order that you've just spoken, and I'll mix it up a little bit more in a minute. We're doing pretty well for time for questions, but if you could keep your answers short, I realise that's incredibly difficult. Now I'm going to try and choose. I won't take the unkind ones. I'm sure they don't mean to be unkind. Why is politics dominated by what politicians say rather than what they do? Amber, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it necessarily is, to be completely frank about it. My favourite stories and the best stories that we do aren't starting with politicians, they're starting with an issue that needs highlighting or solving. And, you know, if we look at something like hospices care, where they weren't receiving any PPE during the worst of the COVID pandemic, and we were able to go and cover that story and then hold politicians to account by bringing it up at the prime ministerial press conferences, which were televised every single day at the time, and sort of say, you know, this is a problem that needs highlighting and solving. And by highlighting the problem, it was actually therefore solved. So I don't think it is necessarily a case, and I wouldn't think a piece would always be the best starting with what a politician says, but clearly there are times when what politicians say is newsworthy, and that is the reason we are covering a story. I suppose, I think it perhaps became its most fraught in and around 2019, when we were at the height of sort of Brexit, and there has been some friction since, obviously, with COVID. I've actually been on maternity leave the last few months, so I've missed some of it, but I think that we really reached the height, sort of frenziness, I suppose, in Brexit during those times, and it was I think people like Rafe Bear have written about this brilliantly. You know, you became very tunnel vision about every night there was a serious vote, and it was about Westminster and Parliament, and you know, you were having to find a different way of telling the same story sort of week after week after week. And I think that our journalism has become better by taking a step back, building it into the communities that watch our news in our case, and the fact we're lucky to have ITV Regions, so we can really get deep into those stories with the people that matter, because the journalists that work there know their stories, they know the people, and use that as a way to fuel how we do our journalism, rather than starting with something necessarily that a politician says.
Thank you. By the way, I don't know who's put these questions in, so I'm not avoiding giving credit to anybody. Haroon, would you like to comment on that? Shall I move on to Katy? While Haroon, I think his IT is perhaps. Katy, would you like to?
I can jump in. Yeah, I mean, to add to Amber, I think ITV do what they do incredibly well, and definitely come from the kind of audience perspective. I think the BBC have tried to do more of that over the years. I've recruited a job in the last couple of years in political correspondence based out of London, particularly to kind of bring the point that politics is not just about Westminster, it's about people's lives, and in the end, everything is political. So you know, if you're not reflecting people's lives within the story that you're telling, you're failing. You know, so I absolutely think that's right. And I think, you know, again, sorry, I'm going to echo Amber, but the years of Brexit, as I sit here in Westminster and look over to the House, where, you know, there was no way to get out of the fact that our country was tearing each other apart over a central point to Westminster, and that was the, you know, start and finish of it, really. But you know, absolutely, the key point is that if you're not saying to your audience, this is why it matters to you, then you failed.
Thank you. Haroon, are you there? Can you come in? If you take yourself off mute.
Sorry, I missed the last bit, so apologies if I repeat because my internet's a bit dodgy. But what I would say is that I think people do focus on what politicians do, and I think you see so many organisations now have fact-check departments, which is proof that politicians are being held to account on what they do, or whether they're saying what they're doing. But at the same time, I appreciate why someone would think that. I think a lot of it, again, comes back to recurring themes. I think social media, 24-hour news, that there's space to fill. There's you know, the internet just keeps going all day round. So sound bites do get featured, and I think in a way that probably, you know, certainly with without wishing to sound even older than I am, in the old days when, you know, you maybe had one news bulletin at lunchtime and one in the evening, and you had a newspaper at the end of the day. But the truth is that there's so much more news about, and that's why a lot of what politicians say will generate headlines, and sometimes even, I think, you know, even little kind of slips of the tongue, you know, they're picked up on social media, and then that becomes a story, and it becomes, you know, a story that would never have been covered, I don't think, in the past.
Thank you, Haroon. I made a completely erroneous, I gave some completely wrong figures today in the House of Lords, so really sorry for anybody who saw that. I doubt anybody saw it. I'm trying to mop up. And actually, it's not that easy because it's all gone in Hansard and it's all wrong. Arjun, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think a lot of what I would say has been said, but I think too often issues tend to be popularized by the opinions about them rather than the facts. And so I think news organizations often fail, including possibly us, to lead with the facts of the matter rather than what someone says about it. I will say, to sort of play devil's advocate as well, that often isn't always a bad thing. For example, when a Conservative MP suggested that the victims of the Grenfell fire were not as smart as he was, I think that really hit home to a lot of people, and to understand the plight of those people who lived in sort of low-income accommodation, and et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, there have been huge failures. Like when, another example I could think of was when Anthony Fauci suggested that the Brits' vaccination regime was dangerous. I think that really didn't do public confidence in vaccinations a lot of good. I think the sort of breathless news coverage where it's like a blow by blow, each politician's statement is the top of the live blog, and it's like, this person said X, this person said Y, isn't great. But I think the success of slow news magazines, weekend magazines, the rising media, things like Tortoise, and I love the New Yorker personally, things like that, show that there is a market for a sort of more considered look at current affairs as well.
Thank you. Rachel, would you like to come in?
Sure. I think I see what the question is getting at, but in some ways our job as journalists is to hold politicians to account, and that does involve matching or comparing what they say with what they actually do. And what politicians say is a really important part of it. It's very revealing about their values, about their policies. As Arjun mentioned, the thing about Grenfell, but if Boris Johnson did say, let the bodies pile high, whatever the quote was, that's an incredibly important, revealing thing. And obviously it's what's the word? It's contested whether or not he did say that, but the words matter. And then obviously actions matter too, but words do matter, and they can't just be ignored.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I have a question here from Lauren McGowan. How important do you think it is for journalists to respond to criticisms of their work online? There seems to be a quite varied approach from journalists on either always calling out hate comments or ignoring and blocking those comments. So perhaps tell us how you deal with it. Haroon, do you want to come in first while you're with us?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, there's obviously a big difference between criticism and hate comments. I think in terms of criticism, so the Guardian was we were kind of told, where we used to have comments below pretty much every article, and we were always told to engage with readers. And when people point out things that they don't agree with, I have a kind of rule where I message them once and I try to kind of engage, but then if they continue and it's just in a tone that I don't like, I'll just stop, because and I think we've gone on about social media here, but this goes to the point that people are just so dyed in the wool on whichever side of the debate they're on, and if I thought, and I guess that's the thing that depresses me about social media. There are lots of good aspects, but it does seem, is to some extent an echo chamber. And I find that the quality of debate, I rarely go on a kind of Twitter thread and go, wow, that's a really good discussion between people with opposing views. Really, it's just people shouting each other down. As I think one of the other panelists said, it's kind of, you're immoral if you disagree with me. And so yeah, my with criticism, I try and respond and say, this is why I did it, or oh, okay, sorry, I got that wrong, I'll change that. With hate stuff, I'm fortunate, despite my my name and my ethnicity, I don't actually get that much, but I don't share it. I know some people think that's the way. I tend to just to be honest, I've never even reported anyone. I just ignore it, to be honest. And yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Katy, do you want to come in? One of my teenage grandsons says Twitter is over, so we've got that to look forward to.
Yeah, my children tell me that all the time. Yeah, I feel really strongly about this actually, and I think that we just shouldn't engage, which does take you to a problem because you don't stop it. So I don't have the answer to it. I just think it goes to back what I was saying at the beginning. Really, is that once you engage as an individual, all you do, as Haroon says, is just repeat the echo chamber. Especially when if I see a member of staff of mine involved in a Twitter fight, and they've got 50,000 followers, and the person they're having a fight with has got 10, but they've just, given that person's view a very loud scream, for no reason whatsoever. And I also think, whatever comes out of anyone's mouth here is the BBC speaking, and we need to be absolutely kind of central about our position and not engage in individual fights with people. I think it's the road to madness. But I do realise that a lot of people feel that we need to be strong on our defence, which of course we should, but there are formal channels for that.
Thank you. Arjun, how do you feel about it?
When I first interned at The Independent, my first job was to scroll through all the comments on all the articles that were published and triage them as to whether they were legitimate criticisms or pointing out errors in the piece, in which case you let the journalist know. If they were abuse or spam, you ignore them or delete them. And if they were very, very well thought out, then you might contact the commenter and ask them whether they want to write something. I tend to take the approach that you'd imagine they're coming up to you in the street. So if they have something nice to say or something interesting to say, then you listen to them, otherwise you ignore them.
Thank you. Very good. Rachel.
We're also encouraged to engage with readers below the line, but to be completely honest, it's a question of time, and quite often I don't have time to do it as much as I ought to. With Twitter, I do, if it's a factual question that somebody's asking about, what was the source of that fact or figure or whatever, I will, if I've got time, do it. But if somebody's rude, I just ignore it. Maybe that's cowardly, but I certainly take Katy's view that as soon as you reply, you are giving them the vacuum of the oxygen of publicity. And actually, I think it's best, ignoring them is the rudest thing you can do at one level and the most disempowering to them. So that's my approach, and I think the problem is it can become utterly overwhelming if you reply to absolutely every single comment, tweet. You'd never actually do anything else in your life. So I actually tend to reply more to letters or emails than to comments below the line or tweets, because I think if somebody has actually taken the time to write like that, then they've put more effort into it. But maybe that's just me being old-fashioned.
No, it's a good point. Good point. Politicians take more notice of letters and emails than they do of tweets. Amber, do you have a comment on that?
No, I think we've sort of covered it all mainly. I mean, I would just say, it's up to our individual journalists what they choose to do with their individual accounts, but we have formal processes for contacting us, and often I think people would find them more fruitful and more engaging than perhaps some forms of social media.
Thank you. Here's another question. If the BBC or ITV try to run campaigns like the brilliant hunger campaign the Standard has run, would they be accused of imbalance? So, Katy, what do you think?
I think that's a better question for Amber, but I'll try and answer it. I think the short answer is, I think it depends what you mean by campaigns, I suppose, actually. I think, should we take issues and work properly with really good journalism and go through all the issues that we should, get to the bottom of whatever the problem is? Absolutely. I think we could do better dedication to issues at the BBC. We tend to, the rush of news means that we don't always sort of focus, for my money, on key stories as much and for as long as we could. And I think, we all try, we talk about it a lot here about, taking a story and really kind of staying with it. Is that a campaign? Well, I think maybe other people would think, that it's more of a campaign in capital letters. I think that would probably give us an issue with impartiality. So, but should we, stick to big issues? Absolutely.
Thank you. Arjun, you want to campaign? Or you do campaign?
I'm perhaps a bit biased in this, given that I helped run the campaign that has just been called brilliant. I think what's great about the Standard and the Independent is that they not only interpret and explain and paint a picture of what's going on to readers, but they also try and have an impact and change things. And other newspapers and broadcasters do this as well, but the Standard goes particularly far and always has. You know, we've run 10 campaigns in the last decade on, you know, slavery, refugees, AIDS, hunger, homelessness. And we do these things because I think journalism isn't just about telling people what's happening, but it's also about standing up for what you believe is right. You know, some of the most famous journalists in history have done so. Emile Zola, George Orwell. I think it's a responsibility, and there are some issues on which you should not be impartial.
Thank you. Rachel?
I don't think I have a particular view on this, apart from I think the hunger campaign at one level, the power of the issue came through with the reporting, and that's not necessarily campaigning. You're not biased if you're reporting facts and the truth. So I think it's absolutely fine for broadcasters to report the facts, and if Marcus Rashford is you know, raising the issue as well, that's objectively news story. That isn't a campaign.
Good point. Amber, do you want to come in, or do you feel it's all been said?
Yeah, well, no, I think, you know, everyone's right to say it depends on the definition of campaign, doesn't it? I mean, you as a journalist have the ability to highlight issues and and voices that may not otherwise be heard. Or, you know, I look back to when I was at Sky, and they did a sort of a lot of stories around plastics at the time, which was a hugely important thing. And we are making sure we have a huge commitment at the moment to climate change and the impact of that specifically to our viewers in the UK. Now, I wouldn't call that the same as the sort of newspaper campaign where you are able perhaps to be more overt in how you go about it, but they are clearly important, and part of being and working in a newsroom is to choose editorial priorities. And I'd say the only commitment we had to that in terms of campaigns is that they matter to real people, and that we're perhaps highlighting issues that might not otherwise get to be heard.
Yes, I love all the climate emergency coverage. Here's one from Marjorie, and she's being nice about Arjun again. She totally agrees with Arjun that the voices of youth are needed as we're seeing issues that will affect their future, for example, the climate crisis. So how do we encourage more youth into news presentation? I'd say, how do we encourage more youth into voting as well? Arjun, tell us.
I think there's no one simple answer. If there were, someone would have done it already. I was the only person in my class to go into journalism. I think I have more friends who went into finance and consulting and all those high-flying white-collar jobs. I think the way to make news relevant again to young people is to start writing, publishing, broadcasting about things that really matter to them. Honestly, as someone who's in journalism, it's pretty hard to see from the inside. So I yield to everyone else.
Right. Rachel, would you like to come in?
I think there's a danger of being patronising and saying we're now going to do something for young people. And obviously, it's really important that young people are engaged in politics and media and political coverage, etc. But I think that if we write things in an engaging and interesting way about issues that are of relevance, you don't have to have a particular targeting of young people policy, as it were. I think it's about being interesting and not patronising, actually. But I don't know. I think I'm running the Education Commission at the moment, which is obviously hugely relevant to young people. And we're going to make a point of at every commission meeting having somebody who's actually going to be affected by the thing we're discussing. So whether that's a student or a school pupil, and then also having kind of panels of people who are affected by the policies. So rather than us talking at sort of inverted commas young people as the media or as politicians, I think it's really important to ask people and involve people. But that's speaking as an old person.
Amber.
I mean, one of my sort of, I suppose, bugbears, and it's slightly different, is entry to journalism, which is basically where we recruit people from and how we recruit people. And that is, you know, not just looking to the obvious places like postgraduate journalism schemes and things like that to find people, but actually, schools who involve apprenticeships and things like that, and just looking to different routes to recruit people. I know my colleagues here are doing a lot of work to make sure that we are trying less conventional routes to have entry into journalism, and we still run our trainee scheme here, which allows young people to be involved. But also, I suppose it's a slightly different point, but it's how you learn to pitch stories as well. I don't think often, it's this word oracy, isn't it? We're not often taught how to sort of sell a story, so to speak. If you're in a morning meeting and you're new and young in the team, how you feel you can have that voice and it be heard. And I think it's about sometimes the culture and the environment that we provide in our meetings to sort of say, if someone has a good idea, it shouldn't just be, those journalists who are known or the top level bosses who are saying what those stories should be or how they're pitched. And it's sort of having a more inclusive way to hear people's stories internally. And that can also mean sometimes just telling people about the best way to pitch in a story and working on people with that. But that doesn't have to be young people, it can be everyone, right? So yeah, I suppose that's my points.
Thank you. Haroon.
I mean, yeah, two points I suppose I'd make. I mean, I think the first one is the same as Rachel. I just think, there is a danger of kind of being patched. So, I don't know, youth have, an attention span of 2 seconds. So when things right for them. And it's all about the quality and the content, but earlier about getting younger newsrooms, because when people come in on kind of the Scott Trust scheme that we have at the Guardian or similar initiatives, they do come up with ideas to do with young people that someone like me, just wouldn't necessarily be aware of. And, it is possible for us to look at kind of policies and how they're likely to affect young people. And maybe that's another thing we should do. But I think there is also getting that diversity of perspective, which involves more young people in newsrooms.
Thank you. Katy?
Yes, I agree with all of that. I think recruitment is a huge challenge, as Amber said, I really do. I think that just in terms of the point Rachel made about patronising, I think that's also really true. I think there is a real question though in terms of getting that youth audience and acknowledging that in the end, they are not necessarily going to go to what we call the traditional platforms or the programmes that have just got an older audience, like Politics Live, for example. So, where do we get to them? And, as we all are, we're now working in a digital age. And I think the digital platforms allow us to do a different type of journalism and a different type of presentation that hopefully reach younger audiences in a way that, my children wouldn't watch programmes that I did when I was younger, but they may click on something and it will bring the BBC to the BBC and to the BBC and to politics.
Thank you. I'm going to try to get 2 more questions in, which is very ambitious. So if you wouldn't mind giving us headlines, if that's impossible, obviously I understand. The first question is from Francis Dickinson. Over the last year, it's been felt that the mainstream media has been a channel for government messaging, especially about behaviour during the pandemic. So it's a difficult double act to pass on government messages and to hold politicians to account. Discuss. Rachel.
I think you can do both, because you can say this is the official advice, but you can also say, actually, how well has the government done in the handling of the pandemic? And actually, I think the media has done both.
Thank you. Brilliant. Amber.
Yes, I'd agree with that, to be honest with you. I think we have a role as a public service broadcaster in order to deliver those messages, but also we have analysis from our editors in News at 10 to be able to critique that sometimes. So I think there is a role for both. It's difficult and we put a lot of thought into it, but both matter.
Thank you. Haroon?
Obviously the media had a responsibility to convey what the government was saying during such a serious time, but I think the media ought to account, and just a very quick example, I've seen people saying, oh, you know, the Guardian, they you know, they're the kind of authoritarian, you know, shut down everything. But I've been reads about kind of, you know, something about the rule of law being challenged by the government doing everything through kind of secondary legislation and not part about fixed penalty notices and the kind of the zealous way they've been handed out and the dubious legality of them. So I think we have.
Haroon, I'm going to stop you because we're having trouble hearing you, but you actually mentioned something I really care about, and so I might talk to you about that, the way the government's passing legislation. Katy, could I come to you?
Just a quick thought to add on to the others. I think you just got to look at the audience figures for the BBC. We do talk about it endlessly about carrying the press conferences and give it a great deal of thought, but particularly at the beginning, the news conferences were watched by millions and millions and millions of people. And in the end, I think that says all that you need to know in terms of the public service appetite and the message that people want to know that information, and that this is a particular time. I do think in the next year, we're going to have to think quite carefully about what we do with that offer. But for the past year, I think, we've probably judged it right.
Thank you very much. We do have a question from B. Rowlett asking about local news and in particular with print online and pressure on journalists to get clicks. Is that something you all experience? And I'm so sorry we're running out of time, but it's a useful. Amber, have you got a comment on that, the pressure?
Not personally, I don't, but I don't use it in the same way. I, for example, use Twitter to basically send out my colleagues' work and say how brilliant it is and to wish people happy birthday. But I do think that there is, a real investment in television at the moment in local news, because we recognise that that's how we get the best of our stories, and that being deep rooted into a community matters incredibly to find some of the most important stories that we can tell. But on clicks, I'm afraid it's not how I use social media personally.
No. Haroon.
I don't feel any pressure to get clicks. I mean, I look at how we have internal stuff that I can look at how well read my articles are, and that does matter to me because I want them to have a wide audience, but I don't feel pressure to get clicks. I mean, I started as a local news reporter. I'm just very saddened by the state of local news. I mean, I think it's kind of been destroyed by the internet to a large degree. And it's a vicious cycle where they don't have money, so they cut reporters, and then reporters are covering about 10 different areas, none of them properly. And then that makes even less people read them.
Katy, thank you, Haroon. Katy, we're running out of time. I'm so sorry. Katy, did you?
Very quickly, yeah. I mean, I suppose there is a reason why there is the phrase or word clickbait, because it's about getting people to read the stuff. So actually, in the end, I think that's just about how you write your headlines and things. But certainly, we don't try and bend it to get people there.
Arjun.
It's sort of two separate questions almost, local news and then clickbait. Just on local news, I think there's two tragedies with the decline of local news. The first is that it was often the first rung in the ladder for a lot of people starting a career in journalism, and that's no longer really possible outside of London and the London Evening Standard. The second is the decline of local reporting means that we have less of an idea what goes on in communities across Britain and America as well. There's an argument that we would have seen things like Brexit and Trump coming much better if we still had those local resources. On sort of clicks, I'm pretty relaxed about how it works at the Independent and Standard. It's a metric that you can use to look at how well your content's doing, and you write stuff knowing that it could be very popular, but also you can write stuff knowing that it would appeal to a niche audience. But it's good that your newspaper carries that.
Thank you, Rachel. Last word.
I'm completely hopeless and I never ever think about it, and that's probably why it's a disaster.
Thank you so much. You've been an amazing panel, and thank you very, very much for coming. And thank you to the audience, and thank you for putting the questions. So I'm afraid I'll have to say goodbye to you all, and I hope you have a good evening. Bye now.